Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we are almost through another NBA season. Once again, we're basically 5 games left to go with most of these teams, and we had a pretty awesome crowd of games since the last time that we recorded, right, on Thursday with for that Friday episode, and we had a few matchups that I thought kind of really stood out, right? So we'll kind of go over the first team, and you have the Golden State Warriors, right, who've now won 5 in a row, right, including a pair of games on a back-to-back, right, one against the Lakers and then another one against the Denver Nuggets, right? Now, the Nuggets were without Jamal Murray, but I thought it was a really impressive game from the Warriors just from the fact that, most people had been already talking about teams like LA and Denver as, possible title contenders, and people had mentioned the Warriors as well. But a knock on the Warriors for some had been the fact that they hadn't really played a lot of really good teams since the Jimmy Butler trade. Right, it's been a pretty light schedule, one of the lightest in the league, and this was kind of a chance to kind of go on a stretch where you can kind of play against some of the better teams to kind of see what they looked like against some more serious competition, and they showed out.
Yeah.
In that Lakers game, they ended up winning that one. Right, I believe they ended up. Oh, yeah, they ended up winning. Let's see, by it was 123 to 116. Right, and it was a game where they were up for most of the game, aside from I think early in the first quarter, because the Lakers had the early edge in the first. Then they went about 10 minutes. The Lakers, went on a 10-minute stretch where they scored, I believe, 2 points. Right, as the Warriors were getting into their switching defense and made it really tough for LA. Luka had a really awful game. He was 6 for 17, 0 of 6 from 3. And then on the other end, right, Steph had 37 and 6, and he's been on a tear recently where he's just, almost every game been giving you 30 plus, including, I think we hadn't mentioned it a ton, but he had 50 against Memphis, right? And then also, in the Nuggets game, we'll get into that in a minute. And then you have Draymond continuing to do his thing defensively, where now he's kind of gotten into the discussion because I think he had mentioned he felt that he should be in the running for Defensive Player of the Year, right? Because for a while it looked like that Evan Mobley was kind of the odds-on favorite, and now, according to Vegas, they think that Draymond's the favorite, so we'll see what happens there, right? Because he's been really good defensively all year. The Warriors have, by and large, been a really good defensive team for the most part. But now they've been even better, and now the team as a whole has been better, right? So his case looks a lot stronger now than it would have before, right? And again, they did a pretty good job against LA, especially, for most of the game, right? Because in the first half, you didn't really get much from LeBron, Austin, or Luka. Then in the second half, LeBron and Austin picked it up. Rui had 24. And then the bench for LA didn't really do much. But the bench for Golden State performed really well because you got 18 off the bench alone from Kuminga, right? None of the other guys did a ton, but 18 as a whole compared to LA's bench, right? That was kind of all the difference in that game, in addition to Brandon Pajemski having 20 points in the first half, including a half-court shot. Not a ton from Jimmy Butler, right? And then Moses Moody had 13 and 3, so the three-point shooting as a whole, they shot 45% from 3, which is really high. And then Luka, like I said, had a pretty horrible game, and they were kind of attacking and hunting him on the switches. And then in the Denver game, right, that was an interesting scenario because of the fact that they had lost the last 9 or 10 games to the Nuggets, right? And it had kind of been a similar setup where Nugget size is tough to overcome, and by and large, they're able to slow down the Warriors on offense, where they just don't really get a whole lot. But in this game, the script flipped. Right now, again, Murray didn't play in this game. He hasn't played in a little bit. But, you kind of saw at least the roadmap for if the Warriors were to win a series against a team like Denver, this is how they would do it, where, they kind of take advantage of now with the subtraction of KCP and Bruce Brown, the lack of perimeter defenders, and, kind of making it all on Christian Brown to try to slow down those guys. And then if it's not him and they get anywhere close to the rim, it's kind of free eats, right, essentially for the Warriors, right? They can use the threat of the shooting to open up pretty much anything and everything. And, Jokic had 33, 12, and 9, including, I think, like 15 in the first quarter, right? And then as soon as he sat and went to the bench, then it all just completely fell apart. and then the Warriors never looked back and pretty much ran them off the floor, right? And then Steph in that game also at 36, 7 of 15 from three, Pods at 26. Butler at 19 in that game. He was really good.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's kind of the thing that we've seen now where this starting five of Steph, Pods, Jimmy, Moses Moody, and Draymond, they are undefeated. They're 14-0 when they start that lineup. I believe they're like, 21-5 as a whole, like since the trade. And I think in games that both Steph and Jimmy have played, I think they've only lost twice, if I'm not mistaken. So pretty much they've been flawless since the trade. Obviously, again, like I said, there was a long stretch where they had a pretty light schedule, but these last few games have been really important because they've been mostly against good teams. They do have a few games left against some weaker competition, like they'll play the Suns. I believe they'll play the Spurs, but they also play the Clippers, and all these games are important because, if you look at the standings, it's super tight, right? Because with that Golden State win over the Lakers, right, they're pretty close to them in the standings. Now, we'll get into a pair of Laker games once we get into them, right? But they're like a game and a half behind the Lakers, and the Nuggets are a full game, right? Prior to the Laker win over OKC, which we'll talk about, they were like half a game, basically. So this is going to be a really crucial stretch for all of these teams because nobody's really shored up anything yet, right? Houston is close because they're 3 games ahead of the Lakers, right? But even then, it's not a complete guarantee, and the Lakers will play the Rockets again. But, it definitely looks like Golden State has a ton of momentum going into the playoffs, and they look great on both ends of the floor.
Yeah, they look, re-energized. I know a lot of people have talked about, what the Luka trade did to LeBron and his morale, but I think, the same could be said, for Steph Curry with the Jimmy Butler trade. I think, we've seen kind of, a fire be lit underneath him, and I think, he's back for sure. Not to say that he was ever gone or anything like that, but you can definitely tell that, having Jimmy Butler in the lineup just changes everything. Like you already talked about, the record, with the two of them is crazy, and this new starting lineup, or the newest starting lineup that they have, is pretty awesome as well. And I think, their success is probably going to be, obviously contingent on their superstars, but I'm also looking at their other guys as well, like really specifically the young guys. How well can Moses Moody, Pajemski, and Kuminga, if he plays, how well can all three of those guys play? Because I think, if they're on their A game, they can push, that team way over the hump and, increase the ceiling, I think, exponentially for that squad. And, I think there's a ton of potential. We've seen a lot of the Warriors discourse, a lot of chatter about, ring number 5 for Steph, automatically we already know what that would do for his legacy, but, is it attainable? Maybe, question mark. I think so. I think they have some of the tools, on the team. I just kind of need to see who they're playing against. I think that matters for sure. But, roster wise, I mean, I think you have to love everything that you've seen, from their starters and obviously their superstars. And really, Steph, it starts with him for sure because we already know what he can do with the ball in his hands. And, he continues to do that. And they've finally put, together, I think, a roster that's kind of acceptable because in the past couple of years, we've been like, Chris Paul, that's not really the answer. Clay was on the decline. So way to pivot and, grab Jimmy Butler and really just tally up the wins nonstop ever since he's been inserted into the lineup. It's really crazy and special.
Yeah, exactly. And that's such a huge thing for them because we talked about it from the perspective of, he needed another guy to help kind of take some of the load off of him because earlier in the season, right, we saw, right, what that looked like where, like you said, he was never necessarily gone, right, but it just felt like everything was a lot more difficult for him. But you look at the personnel, and that was kind of the biggest reason why, where you just didn't really have another guy, because the way that teams would guard them is they would basically sell out and just be like, we don't care about anyone else as long as we can kind of limit whatever Steph can do. And, for a decent amount of the season, it was working, right? And now you can't really do that with Jimmy Butler because he's another threat, not just to score, but also to pass and make plays for others. And you still have to guard Steph the same way, right? Like, it doesn't change how you handle him because you still have to constantly chase him around and make sure that he doesn't just get, clean shots off. And even if he doesn't get a clean shot off, it can still go in. But, that's the big thing for them. And then the role players as a whole, now the game's easier for them because some of those guys, like, say, Brandon Pajemski, he wasn't that good earlier in the season.
Yeah.
But his role was a little bit more outsized in terms of, like, the ask was probably a little bit too high given the lack of talent on the roster, right? And now he's settled into a role that makes a lot more sense for him. And now it's a lot easier for him to kind of do a lot of the other little things. In addition to, now he can take advantage of some more favorable matchups, right? And then a guy like Draymond, you don't need his scoring or as much anymore. Not that you ever needed him to score, but you could. It was kind of hard to get away with some of those games where he's got like 2 to 5 points. But now he can pretty much almost exclusively focus on the defensive end without having to really be too much of a threat to score. And he can still obviously pass and set everybody up. And he's been great on the defensive end. Like I said, all the guys off the bench look a lot better too, right? Like Gary Payton looked like a guy that was kind of not necessarily, I don't want to say washed, but he didn't look that good earlier in the
Mm-hmm.
season. And a lot of the other guys didn't really either, right? And now a lot of them look better. And some of them you're also just not as reliant on. Like you're not quite as reliant on like Buddy Hield going off and consistently
Yeah.
scoring 20 a game off the bench like they were earlier in the season, right? Like you don't have to have Kuminga have a 20-point game where he has to play 35 minutes. I mean, like, obviously, you still would want to get contributions from him, but you're not as dependent on him. But that is a good point where, like, yeah, like the young guys are going to be, a big part of what this team can do going forward because you're going to have to see whether or not those guys are going to be able to, like you said, kind of make the right plays, hit timely shots, right, that they're going to get because Steph is going to draw a ton of attention. And like you said, they're in a great spot right now. It's just all of these teams, it's really dependent on the matchups, right? Like if the playoffs were today, or they would play the Nuggets in the first round, right? And they were able to get the win over the Nuggets in the last game, although Jamal Murray didn't play, right? But is it, there are matchups that are probably a little bit easier, for them than maybe that one. Although again, the Nuggets haven't necessarily looked that great as of late anyways, right? They look like a team that's been trending downwards,
Mm-hmm.
unlike some of these other teams, especially on the defensive end. So,
Yeah.
we'll see. But really impressive to see what they've been able to do thus far.
Oh yeah, big time.
Yeah. And then, we can also go over, Nuggets and Lakers if you want. I mean, I
Sure.
guess, what
Absolutely.
did you think that what did you think that you saw in those matchups, right? Like, did you see anything in either of those games that would make you feel concerned if either of those teams played Golden State?
Well, I it's tough because I think you're always dealing with the Steph factor of him being able to pop off at any given point, and with the Lakers and Nuggets, it's kind of interesting how you can kind of find a way to attack both guys, Luka, and you can also find a way to attack Jokic as well. I think Denver might be a little bit better at masking it because you do have a great back end defender in Aaron Gordon, and you know virtually like he kind of turns into their rim protector at times, and Jokic kind of finds a way to squeeze his way out of things. Whereas Luka, you can kind of hunt him on the perimeter, and then that kind of exposes everything in the middle ground and at the basket as well. So I think that's kind of the key is like hunting those guys and making sure that you kind of exploit every mismatch that you possibly can get. But overall, I think the Lakers, all these teams stand a chance against one another. That's the cool part. Like it's not like you can really confidently say, yeah, Golden State beats this team in a 7-game series, and that's either the Lakers or the Nuggets. And overall, they all have their positives and negatives, right? Like the
Hmm.
Warriors low key can't really do a whole lot against Jokic, in terms of trying to slow him down. But at the same time, that's you also have to find a way if you're Denver to get the other guys going. Like, Jamal Murray has to kind of be on point. And you have to have perimeter shooting from pretty much your whole starting five if you're Denver. And then with the Lakers, it's more so of a can we hide the defensive lapses of the team at times because as LeBron's not a bad defender, but he can also get kind of lost, I think, at this point in his career where it's like, maybe he's not giving 100% on one end of the floor. Granted, he's able to do that a little bit more in terms of, being a more of a two-way player because, he doesn't have to carry the load on offense because you do have Luka, but at the same time, can also hunt Luka as well. AR can kind of hold his own, I think, against a team like Golden State, but, in terms of the matchups that we saw, I mean, Luka had a horrible game on both ends of the floor, and I think that's going to be the key to success if you're Golden State is to truly make him uncomfortable and continue to kind of hunt his head. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Like really, if he plays that badly against any of these teams, you're probably not winning
Hmm.
unless you're getting a crazy game from someone else to make up for it. And they didn't really have anybody off the bench that played well in that game, which, that's the thing for the Warriors where, earlier in the season they had 12, 13 guys that they were playing, but a lot of those guys weren't necessarily that great.
Hmm.
Now they have basically like a set 9 guys, maybe 10, depending on the night, and they all pretty much play, but they all have like a role where, they all know what they're doing and what they're going to be asked to do, and they're a lot more capable of doing it now given the new personnel they have in Jimmy Butler. So that's the nice thing where like now cuz remember there would be games where it's like, why isn't Moses Moody playing? Like
Hmm.
there would be like a game where he'd play 30 minutes and then another game where he plays like 10,
Yeah.
right? And then, a game where like Kyle Anderson plays a bunch and then he doesn't play at all. Or like Lindy Waters started,
Yeah.
at the guard spot for a while, right? And now he's traded to another team and that other team doesn't play him at all, and that's the Pistons.
Right.
So
But then you also
stuff
have
like
kind of
that.
like Pajemski kind of going off too. I think that's
Right.
somewhat of a
Yeah.
factor that you do have to ask, because it's like,
Mhm.
well, can he do it legitimately in a 7-game series? Against that
Right. 'Cause
team,
that's
I don't know, because I mean we were talking about it before we even started recording. Like, if he can turn into AR, which is what you posed, something like AR, then I think that puts the Warriors in a little bit of a different conversation, albeit hypothetical.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think you need those young guys to really be on their A game and kind of emerge.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. They're a team that, again, we already knew that. But like I know
Yeah.
that there had been discourse about the idea of they were like bad team merchants or something like that, where they were mainly playing a light
Right.
schedule.
Right.
But
Right.
the net rating is what it is in terms of they were really good, right? Because some of those bad teams that they are beating now, they weren't beating earlier in the season,
Yep.
right? Like we would talk about, they would lose to a team like Toronto, or they would lose to some other random bad team on a given night, right? Like all these teams, and unfortunately for the standings, all of these teams have games that you wish you could take back,
Yep.
right? Like say if you're a team like LA, you wish you had that loss to the Bulls back,
Ooh.
right? Because then you'd be like probably like 2 games ahead of Denver and Golden State, and with 5 games to go, it's a lot tougher to make that back up. But then you look at Denver, they blew a game against Minnesota and then had to sit their starters against the Spurs and then lost that one too,
Yep.
right? You look at the Warriors, they had a couple games where Steph was out and they blew both of those games against mediocre teams. So, then even Minnesota, right? A couple of Indiana games, and a game to Utah, right? I think where Edwards had been suspended the game before. So every team can kind of look at it from that perspective. But,
Hmm.
I mean, if you look at a lot of these teams in the last 10, like 8-2, 8-2, 5-5, 4-6, for the Nuggets, 5-5 for the Lakers, although they've won 4 of their last 5. And then the Warriors 7-3, Minnesota 7-3, the Clippers are 8-2, and then you have the Grizzlies who are 3-7, right?
Yeah.
So, and then yeah, and then you have the Kings and the Mavs at 9-10 who are 3-7 and 5-5 respectively. Although the Kings got another win over the Cavs before we got on, so
Sure.
that was kind of
Shout out
interesting.
Zach Levine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 37, and then the Suns, right, are like kind of the on the outside looking in. I think they have one more loss than the Mavs, right? They had just lost to the Knicks, I think. So their chances are kind of dwindling. And then Portland is still technically kind of in the mix, but not really, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So, but going back to these other teams, then we had a game earlier today, right, where a pair of games actually, right, but we had a game earlier today, right, where it was you're watching this on Monday. It was between the Lakers and OKC, right? And this was a big game obviously because we had talked about going into this game that this was going to be it was going to be crucial to kind of see what this game looked like, because we know that OKC has been the best team in the league pretty much this whole season, and we know that we felt that this matchup would not be a great matchup for LA, because you look at OKC and it's a long physical athletic team, right? And they have guys that can pick you up full court. They have guys that can get up and down the floor. They get a lot of steals, right? Which, can be a problem if you turn the ball over a ton and you don't have a lot of athletes to match. And it didn't matter, right? Pretty much this was a wire to wire blowout for the Lakers, right? Where they ended up winning 126-99. And really, it was not that close for most of the game. I mean, I think at one point they hit, 10 of their first 12 threes. I think they finished the game 22 of 40 from 3. Crazy hot shooting performance, but a lot of quality shots generated. Some of them were ridiculously contested, but some of it's like that's what Luka does. He makes tough shots. He had 30 points, 6 assists, 7 rebounds, 2 steals in this game, right? A couple of bounce back games for him, right? Because they also had a game after the Warrior game where they played New Orleans. But everybody played really well in this matchup. And, this is kind of, I guess, if you're the Lakers, the roadmap for if you were to try to beat OKC, this is kind of how you would have to do it. Where they did a really good job defensively. I mean, holding OKC under 100. SGA did have 26 and 9, but he was a minus 20. Most of his shots were the type of shots that you want him to take if you're the defense, right? It wasn't like they just gave up open drives and no free throw attempts either, which is really hard to do. And this is coming off a loss that OKC had to Houston, where I think he had 2 free throw attempts.
Hmm.
So back-to-back losses for OKC. Maybe it doesn't mean anything because they've wrapped up the 1 seed in the West. I don't I don't think they've wrapped up the 1 seed in the league, although the loss to Cleveland although the Cleveland loss to the Kings kind of makes that easier. But what did you see in this game from both teams' perspective, and was there anything that kind of stood out to you from either team?
I think this is probably where a lot of the negative discourse I think around Oklahoma City probably comes from, where it's like, the two big lineup, I guess it worked a little offensively, but at times there were times I kind of questioned why they went to this, lineup in a matchup like this, but that's neither really here nor there. But, I think the glaring issue is J-Dub. Offensively, he didn't really do, too much. A lot of his points came from the free throw line, which is, fine, but I think in terms of creation and being that second guy, I think you got to show up, especially, I don't care really when this game occurs in the regular season. I think you have to show up and, really make a statement because, the Lakers showed up. They had a hot shooting night, like you talked about. Luka with a great game, Braun doing it all, AR as well being the perfect complement. I think you kind of just wanted to see that from Oklahoma City as well, since there's so much noise around them, being potential frauds, whereas there's a lot of hype around the Lakers, potentially, grasping the title and stuff like that. So, and Chet, I kind of want to see them get him more involved in the offense. I know, he's more of kind of like the last guy to finish off the play more so than be that creator. But, if J-Dub's shot isn't falling, if Shea is kind of, having a weird game, then I think you have to kind of look elsewhere, and that was kind of concerning for me, but not to the point where I'm ready to say like, yeah, they're a fraud. But I think this game perfectly shows why people do have issues with Oklahoma City and think that they're not going to win the title this year, or they might not even represent the Western Conference. You know what I mean? And it's like,
Right.
I get that 100%, but it's one regular season game. But I think if you're OKC, you kind of leave feeling kind of iffy about this one, especially coming off of a loss to another team that's kind of behind you in the Rockets. And, Shea kind of got boxed once again.
Yeah, and for OKC, they actually this season, I believe, split the season series with Houston
Yeah.
because I mean, I think Houston won. They won a game against Oklahoma City really early in the
Yes, they
season,
did.
right? I think we talked about it. Yeah, so Houston was able to, and they kind of won. It was different, right, from LA, but they won kind of in a way where it's like Şengün basically kind of overwhelms the guys on OKC in the
Yes.
paint because it is, even though they do have the double bigs, a lot of the other guys are kind of small.
Yes.
And then Jalen Green kind of exploded for an offensive performance, right? That's kind of one of the best ways for Houston to be able to pull out wins.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of their roadmap against a team like Oklahoma City. But like you said, it's one game, but it does kind of showcase in some of these moments, right, why people might be a little bit concerned about, like you said, OKC being able to come out of the West. Like I still think they can do it. And, we're not changing our pick in terms of them coming out of the West. But again, if you're OKC, you do have to be a little bit more, I think, concerned. But, they're still 8-2 in their last 10 with these last 2 losses coming up. They still wrapped up the 1 seed, but it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's definitely not going to be a cakewalk for them. And like you said, their other guys are going to have to be better, right? Because like you could get by with an SGA game like this
Mm-hmm.
probably if, like you said, some of the other guys had shown up, right? Because like you said, J-Dub, 4 of 14 from the field, right? That's not good enough. Chet, only really 6 shot attempts, 10 points, 1 block, 3 rebounds, 2 of 3 from 3. Just not much from, the other starters outside of SGA. And that's been the concern that people have had with Oklahoma City is, can you rely on Jalen Williams to be your secondary guy in the playoffs, because if he has games like these, then it's going to be really difficult, right? When you look at these other teams and you look at the second options that they have, right? I mean, or in the case of LA, you have three, right? But
Yeah.
even beyond, yeah, but even beyond a team like LA, right? Like Golden State's got two guys. I mean, Denver's got two guys, right? I mean, even a team like, Minnesota, I guess, has two guys. The Clippers have multiple guys. And then even out east, right? Boston, obviously they have Tatum and Brown, and others. But yeah, that's it. It's tough to have a game like that at this point in the season. But, you know, it's there's only a few more games to go. Maybe you kind of give them a pass. But I do think with this close to the end of the regular season, you'd like to kind of be closer to playoff form as opposed to this kind of game, right?
Yeah.
Because at least like with the Rockets game, like they fought back, but Houston just was better. But this one was pretty much just a beatdown from the beginning. Where, like you could
Exactly.
just kind of tell early on. And I know they've had a lot of games where it's like they're getting beat in the first half, then they just have this long stretch where they just completely shut down the other team's offense, and that kind of is enough to get them back in the game. But it didn't matter in this one because the Lakers were just completely on point offensively, right? Where there was a lot of good stuff in terms of what all those guys were doing and the actions they were running. What do you think of this lineup that people have talked about, right? Where I think JJ Redick mentioned it as like Luca and the Banshees, right? Where it's like these lineups that I think some people are a little bit skeptical about, where it's like Luca and then pretty much like four other mostly defensive oriented guys, right? Where it's like him, Gabe Vincent, Dorian Finney-Smith, Goodwin, Vando, sometimes Rui's in there. They had like a couple of stretches where like Connect was in there, but he doesn't really play anymore. But what do you think of those lineups? Because there's a lot of people that feel a little bit skeptical about it because they did it against the Warriors, but it looked like a problem because he didn't have a good game. And when he doesn't have a good game and he's really the only creator out there, then it becomes a problem and you can't really score and you're not going to get stops anyways because you can't really score. But what do you think about it? Do you see it as something that can kind of be changed, or is it more so like you're just going to have to kind of hope and pray that Luka can kind of just find his way with some of those lineups? Because it is, it's a roster that's not a perfect roster, so you do have to find some balance.
I mean, it's situational. I don't love it. I'm more of a guy that would prefer to have, a secondary ball handler. But, at the end of the day, I mean, like you said, it's not a perfect roster. You can't play Braun, Luca, and AR the whole game, all together. And, I do understand the philosophy where it's like Luca is in that caliber where he can carry the offense alone, but I think it's better when he gets guys involved. I think that's kind of the track record, and it's kind of hard to get some of those guys involved who don't really have, a ton of offensive upside. It's more so like they have to be the finishers of a
Right.
play. Like I said, Luca can get that done, but I think that's a little bit not too much to ask because you never want to say that that's too much to ask for your superstar.
Mhm.
But I'm not a fan of those lineups. I would kind of prefer if you could, maybe slot in AR or Braun. But like I said, I get it. It's really hard to do that considering the roster. So I would probably wait and see who they upgrade and stuff like that. Because I mean, like some of those guys aren't bad. Like Gabe Vincent isn't horrible. He's kind of come alive. Um, you know, way better than last year, I would say.
Right.
But still not, a top tier secondary offensive kind of guy coming off the bench, and
Yeah.
he's really
Usually
more of a
hot or
defensive guy. So
usually hot or cold offensively.
exactly, like you do look at the roster, and when it is just Luka out there, you're really putting all your eggs in one basket and really hoping that he can kind of carry the load offensively. Like I said, which
Mhm.
he can do. It's not that he can't do it. It's just a matter of when it looks really bad. Of course, it's gonna be really
You're right.
freaking bad.
Yeah, because like say against the Warriors, he didn't play very well, but against OKC in New Orleans, much better play. And that's like you said, that's kind of they're gonna go as far as their main guys can take them, and then the role players are gonna have to knock down shots. Like and again, like we said, it's all about matchups, right? Where we know that a lot and that all these teams are they capable of beating anybody? Sure, right? But are there teams that seemingly are better for them than others? Yeah. But I thought this was good to see because it gave us an idea of what it could look like. And they'll play again on Tuesday, right? So, assuming that OKC still plays their guys, maybe they don't. I don't know if they will, but if they do, right? Maybe we'll see a different look and maybe we'll see a different version, a different response. And then we'll have like, maybe like a decent idea of what it would look like in a playoff series. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, for OKC, it's going to come down to also the non-SGA guys and whether or not they can get it done on the offensive end. Because I think, defensively, they are really good, although in this game, gave up 126. So that wasn't necessarily the case. But sometimes it is just like, hey, you lost to a team that made a lot of really tough shots, and they were just better than you in this game. But I think for the Lakers, again, I thought the more impressive thing was the defense because we
Agreed.
know defensively there was a long stretch where they were like the number one defense, and then they had kind of fallen off, and then you were kind of waiting to see if they could get back to it. And it was much better in this game against the best team in the NBA. So I thought that was good progress
Yeah.
to see from that team. If you're gonna buy stock into the Lakers, which we've talked about where you should, right? Like they're not going to be the favorite to come out of the West, but they're going to be a dangerous team.
Big time.
Yeah. And what do you think about these other teams right towards that middle section or bottom section of the top 8, right, where we see Minnesota winning 5 straight and then the Clippers winning 4 straight, right? Both of them 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 respectively.
I love it. Minnesota's got to do everything that they possibly can to avoid the play-in at all costs. So I kind of expect them to, have a strong finish to the season. And the Clippers are probably feeling the same way. You've got a stellar coach. You've got Kawhi, who we already know what he can be when fully healthy. And I think, there's a lot to like about both of these teams. Tremendous upsides for both of them. It's going to really be, I think, probably a photo finish. But if I'm going to be honest, I'll probably pick Minnesota just because I think they probably have a little bit better personnel to close out the season. You know what I mean? And I just think Ant is probably, probably going to finish the season a little bit stronger than Claw, but we'll see what happens. But I think both those teams, are, I think this is the best way to put it. It's so saturated with talent. The West is like, the Clippers are not really a play-in team. Let's be real. Like they're really not a play-in team.
More losses than the Lakers, who are the 3 seed.
Exactly. So that's how saturated it really is. Like if the Clippers are in the play-in, whoop-de-doo. But at the end of the day, we already know that the Clippers or Minnesota are really not a play-in caliber team. They're better than that.
Right. Yeah. Like pretty much anyone in the top 8 is capable of winning a first-round matchup,
Agreed.
right? Like take OKC out of it because they have 60-plus wins,
Sure.
so we expect them to win a first-round matchup. But I'm just saying any of those top 8 teams have a real chance to win a first-round matchup, and some of them could win more than one, right? I guess of those 8 teams, just kind of as a thought exercise, which one would you be the most surprised, let's say, if they made the conference finals?
Probably Houston.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's kind of wild to say that they're the 2 seed, and that would be crazy if they made the conference finals. But it comes down to the experience. It comes down, or lack of experience, I should say. We really don't know who's going to be the number 1 option in the playoffs. Is it going to be Şengün? Is it going to be Jalen Green? That's where I'm like, okay, I love the defensive upside of the team, but I don't think that pure, tenacity on that end of the floor can really carry them all the way to the Western Conference Finals. I think it could, get them out of the first round. I think you could get them a spot in the second round, but not the conference finals. But I guess that's kind of like the obvious pick. But, if we're talking middling teams, I would be surprised if the Clippers made it. I can kind of see the blueprint for that team blowing up because, say Kawhi goes down, hopefully he doesn't, knock on wood. Say Harden flames out. I mean, you're kind of stuck with Norman Powell and Zubac, great players, but I just don't think that those guys, coupled with the replacements for, Kawhi, would really do enough damage to get to the Western Conference Finals. So I'd probably say Houston is the obvious pick. Clippers would be my backup.
I'd say my backup would probably be the Grizzlies, just based off the fact that they are 3-7 in their last. They have won 2 in a row, but again, the pattern that we've seen is it's mostly come against losing teams, right? Which again, you do have to beat those teams. And in fairness, they did beat Detroit, right? And Ja didn't play in that game. So, obviously, like that's still a good win, right? Like the Pistons are a good team. I think the Pistons may have been without, I guess, Tobias Harris, but like still, like, that's a winnable game for Detroit, right? So that's a good win. And then I believe as the last time we recorded, they had gotten a game winner against the Heat, right?
Yes.
Who are below 500. They've been better as of late, but they're still not like a great team. So I'd say that's probably my backup because I think for the Clippers, I think it probably comes down to health. And then, like you said, is this Norman Powell thing for real in the postseason? Because I think if it's not right, then you're going to be a little bit more reliant on Harden. And then we know for him in the playoffs, it's not been a great track record. But if Norman Powell is for real, right, and he keeps up his production, then the Harden stuff doesn't matter as much. And on top of that, then you have Kawhi, right, who has also been really good. So, I think, like you said, there's a world where any of these teams could go out in the first round. Any of these teams could probably make the conference finals with the exception of a couple. Like, I would be surprised if Houston made it. But I think they could win a first round series, but I think it would probably have to be against another team that doesn't have a ton of experience, which, looking down the list, probably Memphis,
Yeah.
right? That's probably the one where I think that could be a winnable matchup for them. But outside of that, I think it'd probably be really tough for them to pull it off against some of
Agreed.
these other teams, unless you got a coming out party, which we've talked about for one of their young guys.
Yeah.
And then I guess what team after OKC do you think is the most likely to make the conference finals, given what you've seen?
It's a good question. Part of me wants to say LA, the Lakers, that is,
Mm-hmm.
just because of their trio. We already know what they can do, and I think come playoff time, we've seen that what Luka looks like. We already know what Braun looks like. AR as well. All three of these guys are really playoff risers, so that would probably be my pick. I think Golden State is another safe pick as well because of same thing where it's like the Steph factor, and then you
Mm-hmm.
add Jimmy into that mix. I'm just so excited to really see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Like what does that look like? Because I think it'll look good no matter what, but how good? Because depending on how good, I think it might be a finals trip. But
Mm-hmm.
I would say those two teams for me.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a running theme of teams that have probably a little bit more
Heck
experience
yeah,
in the postseason, right? And like their stars are still very high level stars, right?
heck
Like the
yeah,
best players on those teams are still guys that we know can get it done in a playoff series, right? So I think that's kind of the running theme, outside of, we're crossing it over with Oklahoma City, right, which doesn't have a ton of experience, although they do have a couple of, you got a guy, I guess Caruso was on a championship team, but
sure.
most of the main guys don't have like a ton of playoff experience.
Hmm.
So, that's kind of one of the reasons I think why there are people who feel like that they're more than likely, not maybe not more than likely, but there are a growing number of people who I think feel like they might be able to be had, which, again, that, it just kind of comes down to recency bias based off of what we've seen the last couple of games. But, if they figure some of that stuff out, then they'll be perfectly fine, I think.
Yeah,
So we'll see.
I
This is
think
this
they'll.
is the time to kind of take some of those beatings and then kind of learn from them and go from there.
Yeah, I think they'll be representing the West. I'm really not really shaken up by it. I know you aren't either.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. And then I guess if we move over to the East, right? I guess you can kind of look at the Milwaukee Bucks. They've won 3 in a row, right? And I mean, I guess Giannis has had a couple of crazy stat lines, to kind of try to keep his team's hope alive, right? In regards to trying to at least potentially make a run. You look at his last few games, right? I mean, what did he have? Like a 20 assist triple double. I think they took one of those assists. Oh, wait, no, they didn't. Yeah, so he still has the 35, 20, and 17 triple
yeah,
double. I mean, 37, 11, and 3. And then also you have 36, 15, and 10. I mean, again, it's not like it's against crazy competition, but, the fact that he's putting up these big numbers and trying to make a late run. I know he was ruled out of the Pelicans game that started before we played, but just kind of wanted to shout him out just as having just like a crazy, stretch of games and much needed as well because they need him to pull out these numbers in these games because if he doesn't, then that's when you're going to probably start picking up some losses. And then on top of that, then you have another issue where you're gonna fall a little bit further back in the standings because they were able to bounce back up to 5, right? They're what, like half a game ahead of Detroit. So of course that could always change. But, this is kind of the time now where and it seems like they still think that Lillard can come back, right? So if he can, we'll see. With the way Giannis is playing, right, that might be able to swing a series, right? Like, I mean, I don't necessarily think they'll probably be able to go much past the first round. We'll see. But at the very least, it's not a guy that I'd want to play against in a first round matchup.
Heck yeah. I mean, that was my pick for MVP this season. So I I get it, and I love to see that kind of play from him because it is truly inspiring, considering a lot because at some point you would have thought they might have given up, and been like, well, Dame's out, I don't know, but yeah, Giannis has been on a freaking tear, and shout out to Milwaukee because they're trying to climb. Don't think they will, but I think they'll be okay as long as they kind of stay above Detroit.
Yeah. And also shout out Jalen Brunson. He did come back.
Yes, sir.
Finally, he came back today, Sunday. You're watching this Monday. He came back against the Phoenix Suns,
Hmm.
right? And in the win over the Suns, didn't really put up much in terms of numbers, 15-6, but he's been out for quite a while, right? This is his first game back, and he's got to get his legs back under him, right, for a potential postseason run, right? Because I mean, obviously they're gonna make the playoffs, right? But ideally, you want to go as far as you can, and they're only going to go as far as he can potentially take them, right? He's played 62 games, so I think if we look at their record, they're 49-28, right? So they have, I guess, they're at game 76. So is there still a way for him to be able to get onto that All NBA? I guess he'd have to play every game down the stretch.
Yeah, I think he would, and I think he probably will. Maybe the
Because it's
numbers won't be
65 or
crazy.
67?
I
Is
think
it
it's
65 or
I think
67?
it's 67.
Okay, yeah. So getting really close there, essentially, right?
Hmm. But
So
I think he'll be
yeah,
all right.
so yeah, and that is kind of unfortunate. Where like basically a 2 week injury, not really his fault, just a freak injury, could potentially take him out of that. But unfortunately, it is what it is. But again, they're gonna need him, right? And they're with him coming back and them winning 6-4 in their last 10. We'll see what they'll be able to do. Do you make anything of the Cavs, right? Who just lost a game against the Kings, 6-4 in their last 10? Not
Nope.
really worried.
Nope, not worried at all. Similar thing to
Yeah.
Oklahoma City. Embarrassing as heck. Don't get me wrong. Shouldn't lose that game, but at the same time,
Right.
doesn't really amount to anything at this point in the season. We already know they're number one in the East for a reason, and we're excited to see them in the playoffs.
Yeah. And then I guess last but not least, also just shout out to the Indiana Pacers, right? Who are 8-2 in their last 10. They're currently in a game against the Nuggets as we speak. But, again, we've already talked about them before. Where now Halliburton's back to looking like himself, right? Because we talked about him earlier in the season. What was going on? What was the deal in terms of, him struggling? But he's been a lot better since he's come back. And a lot of the other guys that have come back now, they're healthy and they're playing well as well. Do you believe that Indiana could potentially win more than one round, or do you think not that last year was a fluke, but I guess yeah, like do you believe that they could win more than one round? Could they get back to the conference finals, or do you think maybe one round and then that might be it?
I think their ceiling is second round at this point because I think I have a little bit more confidence in Boston and Cleveland, and I think those are going to be the representatives in the Eastern Conference Finals. So, unfortunately for Indiana, as much as I love that team, and especially what they do on the offensive end and how they've really faced a lot of adversity this season and never back down from it once. Like you said, Halliburton bouncing back. They heard a lot of the noise last year where it's like, yeah, you could be one of the best offenses in the league, but at the same time, you can't defend. But this year, they've been pretty solid defensively. So, I think it's a great story, but I don't think that they'll be representing,
Mhm.
I don't think they'll be a representative in the Eastern Conference Finals, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I guess yeah, I think they could be a spoiler, but I think I'd
Sure.
be a little bit more surprised
They'll always
if
play
they.
that spoiler role because they're so volatile and anything can kind of happen because they're one of those teams where it's like if you let them get hot, you might as well just lose the game at that point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. It's going to be a crazy race to the finish, right?
For
Because
sure.
again, we only have 5 games. I believe the play-in is in about a week and a half or so. So
Yeah.
we're pretty much in crunch time here.
Close, close, close.
So now, guess kind of to conclude it out, we will read a comment that we got, from our last YouTube short, and it said "W takes," right. This is from Kimberly Reno, right, and just basically much appreciated, right. This was in reference to our last short on YouTube, right, the NBA playoff X factors, right. This was tied into our last regular episode as well, right, where we basically kind of discussed like a few key playoff X factors for some of the contending teams.
Yeah, I mean, appreciate the comment for sure. And, even on TikTok, please go follow our TikTok as well.
Mhm.
We had some positive reception. Everybody kind of agreed with our takes. And that's a good thing. I think when everybody's kind of in general agreement, that means we're kind of doing something right. So, you know,
Mhm.
shout out to, the commenter and all that stuff. And please, guys,
Yeah.
continue to comment because we will read it.
Yeah. And then in our last in IG post, we posed the question of who's the biggest X factor going into these playoffs, right? And we had Jalen Williams, we had Austin Reeves, Evan Mobley. Those were people mentioned in our video. Then we also had someone else, and we had 60% of the responses say someone else, right? So it seems like most people in this one were more locked in on maybe some other potential playoff X factors. Again, we talked about all of them in our regular videos, so you can check out that last episode. But I guess maybe guys like say a Jimmy Butler, right, or for Boston, right, maybe a guy like a Porzingis or Jalen Brown, which we
Sure.
also mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say like, the wing guys for New York. Um,
Hmm.
you know, maybe Jamal Murray for Denver. Like, there's so many options. Like you said, we did talk about it in our last video. So if you want to hear our, thoughts and opinions on that, please go check out the last episode.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments on, all these games and all these matchups, potential playoff seeding, because we're right down to the wire. Like I said, we have basically a week or so to go in the regular season, less than 5 games to go for most of these teams. Nothing's really been clinched in the Western Conference outside of OKC. So let us know your thoughts on all these teams. And again, if you want to contribute to any of these polls that we put out, right, and just so you can see what type of responses we put out, they're always on Instagram. Of course, you can always leave a comment on our videos or our shorts or any of our socials, and we'll try to read it at the end of the video, and continue to like and subscribe to our channel and like our videos. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next episode.